Imagine waking up one day and realizing that your entire existence, every single choice you have ever made, was carefully orchestrated by someone else. Imagine living in a world of absolute perfection, a golden cage where every whim is catered to, every desire is anticipated, and yet, your soul is completely starving. It's an unsettling paradox, isn't it? The idea that ultimate luxury could actually be a psychological prison. We spend our entire lives chasing comfort, status, and security, but what happens when you are born into so much of it that it completely strips away your humanity? This isn't just a hypothetical philosophical dilemma. It is the emotional engine driving one of the most culturally significant, wildly entertaining, and deceptively deep cinematic journeys of the late 20th century. A story about a man who had to strip away every single title, every ounce of his immense wealth, and travel thousands of miles across an ocean just to find out who he actually was when nobody was bowing to him. Back in 1988, the cinematic landscape was witnessing a fascinating shift, and right at the center of that universe was a visionary director named John Landis and an absolute powerhouse of an actor operating at the absolute peak of his creative superpowers, Eddie Murphy. Coming off a string of massive, high-octane comedy hits, Murphy wanted to create something different, something that combined his razor-sharp comedic timing with a genuinely sweeping, romantic, and emotionally grounded narrative. The result was Coming to America, a film that shattered expectations, redefined the romantic comedy genre, and grossed nearly $300 million worldwide. But looking past the infectious laughter, the legendary improvisations, and the groundbreaking makeup effects engineered by the legendary Rick Baker, you find a movie with an incredibly warm heart and a timeless message about identity, respect, and the arduous journey of self-discovery. It's a film that resonates just as deeply with modern audiences today because, at its core, it speaks to a universal human truth, the desperate need to be loved for exactly who you are, not what you represent. The narrative transports us immediately to the fictional, breathtakingly beautiful African kingdom of Zamunda. The visual imagery here is absolutely intentional, painted with lush, vibrant tones of gold, deep reds, and emerald greens that contrast sharply with how Western cinema historically portrayed the African continent. This is a land of supreme majesty, untouched by colonial scars, thriving in its own self-sustained paradise. We enter a palace of unfathomable scale, where we meet Prince Akeem on the morning of his 21st birthday. He is being awakened by a full orchestra playing right outside his bedroom doors, followed by a literal procession of royal bathers who wash his body, brush his teeth, and scatter rose petals beneath his every step. It is a spectacle of extreme privilege, filmed with a grand, wide-angled lens to make the audience feel the sheer weight and opulence of this world. But look closely at Akeem's eyes. There is no joy there. There is no pride. Instead, there is a profound, quiet exhaustion. When Akeem sits down with his father, King Jaffe Jaffer, played with an unforgettable, booming, and uncompromising authority by the legendary James Earl Jones, the true conflict of the film is laid bare. The king has arranged a marriage for his son, presenting a woman who has been trained since birth to do nothing but obey the prince's every command. In a scene that is played for brilliant comedic effect but carries a heavy emotional undertone, Akeem tests his prospective bride, asking her to bark like a dog and hop on one leg. She does it instantly, without a hint of hesitation or personal dignity. For King Jaffe, this is perfection. It is how things have always been done, maintaining the rigid structure of tradition. But for Akeem, it is a horrifying realization. He doesn't want a servant, he wants an equal. He wants a woman who thinks, who challenges him, who has her own intellect and passions. He realizes that if he stays in Zamunda, he will spend the rest of his life surrounded by people who only see his crown, never his humanity. Driven by a sudden, desperate urge for autonomy, Akeem convinces his father to grant him a 40-day reprieve, a temporary journey under the guise of sowing his wild oats before settling into his royal duties. King Jaffe, misinterpreting his son's deeper philosophical crisis as a mere desire for hedonistic pleasure, agrees. To accompany Akim, the king sends Semi, the prince's fiercely loyal, luxury-loving companion played with magnificent, deadpan perfection by Arsenio Hall. Semi represents the status quo. He loves the privilege of the court and has absolutely no desire to change. But Akim has a very specific destination in mind for their journey, a place whose very name promises exactly what he is searching for: New York City, specifically the borough of Queens. The transition from the pristine, structured paradise of Zamunda to the gritty, chaotic, winter landscape of late 80s New York is an absolute masterclass in visual storytelling and tonal contrast. The bright, warm colors of the palace are instantly replaced by muted grays, dirty snow, piling trash, and the relentless, deafening roar of urban life. Franco-American cinematographer Woody Omans uses handheld cameras and tighter, street-level framing here, making the environment feel incredibly claustrophobic and unpredictable. To Semi's absolute horror, Akim deliberately bypasses Manhattan's luxury hotels and directs them straight into the heart of a rundown, working-class neighborhood. He rents a filthy, unheated, vermin-infested apartment that looks like a war zone, and as he looks out the broken window at the graffiti-covered streets, his face lights up with a pure, ecstatic joy. For the first time in his 21 years, he is surrounded by real, unvarnished life. He is finally free. What makes this segment of the film work so beautifully on a psychological level is Akim's complete lack of arrogance. He doesn't look down on this poverty, he embraces it as an equalizer. He wants to earn his place in the world. To fully commit to the ruse, he strips away his royal garments, packs away his wealth, and insists that they live like ordinary, struggling immigrants. It is here that the film introduces its brilliant, iconic subplot involving the local neighborhood barbershop. Through the magic of Rick Baker's revolutionary prosthetics, Eddie Murphy and Arsenio Hall transform into multiple distinct characters, including the old Jewish man Saul and the loudmouthed barber Clarence. These scenes aren't just comedic filler, they serve a vital narrative purpose. The barbershop functions as the democratic heartbeat of the community, a place where people argue passionately about boxing, politics, and culture without any regard for status. It is a world where words and character matter more than titles, providing Akim with his very first taste of genuine human connection. The emotional core of the film truly ignites when Akim attends a local community rally and catches sight of Lisa McDowell, played with a luminous, fiercely independent grace by Sherry Headley. Lisa is organizing a charity drive, speaking with an elegant, passionate intelligence that instantly captivates the prince. She isn't a passive figure waiting to be rescued. She is an active leader in her community. Akim knows instantly that this is the woman he has been searching for his entire life. But to win her heart, he cannot rely on his wealth or his royal lineage. He must win her over based entirely on his character, his kindness, and his work ethic. To get closer to her, Akim and a highly reluctant Semi secure employment at her father's fast food restaurant, McDowell's, a hilarious, thinly veiled counterfeit of McDonald's. Watching a man who was once washed by royal bathers cheerfully grab a mop, clean up grease, and take out mountains of trash with a genuine smile on his face is both incredibly funny and profoundly moving. It shows a rare level of emotional maturity. Akim doesn't view the work as beneath him. He views it as a privilege because it brings him closer to the woman he loves and the humanity he craves. However, the path to Lisa's heart is blocked by a formidable obstacle in the form of Daryl Jenks, her wealthy, arrogant boyfriend played with exquisite, punchable perfection by Eric LaSalle. Daryl is the heir to a hair grease empire, a man obsessed with status, branding, and superficial luxury. The psychological irony here is brilliant. Daryl, a commoner, behaves with the toxic, entitled arrogance that one might expect from a spoiled prince, while Akim, an actual royal deity, carries himself with the profound humility of a saint. As the days turn into weeks, The film masterfully builds a slow-burning, deeply affecting romance between Akeem and Lisa. They walk through the snowy streets of New York, talking about life, ambitions, and values. Lisa is continuously caught off guard by Akeem's profound gentleness, his courtly manners, and his unwavering respect for her intellect. He doesn't try to impress her with material possessions. Instead, he listens to her dreams and supports her endeavors. John Landis uses a warm, intimate lighting palette during these shared scenes, isolating them from the chaotic, loud background of the city, making it feel as though their love is creating its own sanctuary in the middle of a concrete jungle. But beneath this beautiful romance, a ticking clock is relentlessly counting down, and a massive web of deception is growing thicker by the day. The tension elevates dramatically when Semi, completely broken by the grueling demands of manual labor and the freezing conditions of their apartment, decides he can no longer live like a peasant. Behind Akeem's back, Semi uses their secret funds to transform their dilapidated apartment into a high-tech luxury suite and sends a wire transfer to Zamunda requesting more money. This single, selfish act triggers a catastrophic chain reaction. The wire transfer alerts King Jaffe Jaffer that his son is not traveling the world as intended, but is living in poverty in the depths of Queens. Believing his heir has been corrupted or kidnapped, the king prepares to launch a full royal expedition to the United States to retrieve him. Meanwhile, Akeem's relationship with Lisa reaches a critical turning point. During a formal dinner party hosted by her father, Cleo McDowell, a man who desperately wants his daughter to marry into wealth, Daryl unilaterally announces his engagement to Lisa without even asking for her consent. It is a moment of supreme arrogance that shatters Lisa's patience. Distraught and angry, she seeks comfort from Akeem, who walks her home in the quiet, falling snow. In this vulnerable moment, away from the expectations of her family, Lisa realizes that Akeem is the man who truly values her soul. They share a deeply emotional, passionate kiss, cementing their bond. Akeem is overjoyed, believing he has finally achieved his dream. He has found a woman who loves him for himself. He resolves to tell her the absolute truth about his identity the very next morning, wanting to begin their life together on a foundation of complete honesty. But fate, as it always does in great dramatic narratives, strikes a cruel blow before he gets the chance. The very next morning, King Jaffe Jaffer arrives in Queens with the full, overwhelming force of the Zamundan royal court. They arrive in a fleet of stretch limousines, completely shutting down the neighborhood, dripping in gold, furs, and absolute authority. The king and queen march directly into the McDowell home, exposing Akeem's entire secret identity to a stunned, utterly bewildered Cleo McDowell. When Lisa learns the truth, the revelation doesn't bring her joy or excitement. Instead, it breaks her heart. She doesn't see a fairy tale prince, she sees a liar. She feels deeply manipulated, believing that her genuine emotions were treated as a game by a wealthy man playing dress-up in her world. The scene where Lisa confronts Akeem in the rain outside her apartment is the absolute emotional zenith of the film. The rain pours down, washing away the bright, comedic energy of the movie, leaving only raw, exposed pain. Akeem desperately tries to explain that he hid the truth because he wanted something real, but Lisa, blinded by hurt and betrayal, rejects him. She tells him that trust is the foundation of love, and by denying her the truth, he denied her the choice. It is a devastating moment that forces the audience to confront the heavy moral cost of deception, even when it is born out of a pure desire for love. Devastated and defeated, Akeem is forced to return to Zamunda with his family. The journey back is filmed with a stark, cold formality that mirrors the opening of the movie, but the emotional landscape has completely changed. Akeem is no longer just a bored prince. He is a man who has known true freedom and genuine love, making his return to the golden cage infinitely more painful. He prepares to ascend the altar to marry the woman arranged for him, his face a mask of absolute resignation. He has accepted his fate, believing that his dream of a meaningful life was nothing more than a beautiful, transient illusion. But back in New York, King Jaffe Jaffer has a quiet, profound realization. He sees the lingering grief in his son's eyes, and he remembers the fierce, unyielding dignity of the young woman from Queens who refused to be bought by a royal title. In a powerful, silent act of parental love and cultural evolution, the king realizes that tradition should serve humanity, not crush it. The film climaxes with a breathtaking royal wedding ceremony in Zamunda. The music swells, the dancers move with hypnotic grace, and Akeem stands at the altar, waiting for his veiled bride to walk down the aisle. He expects the submissive woman he rejected weeks ago. But as the bride reaches the altar and lifts her veil, the screen erupts with an overwhelming emotional release. It is Lisa. She has traveled across the world, choosing to accept him, crown and all, because she realized that his love was entirely real. As they look out over the cheering crowds of Zamunda, Lisa playfully asks Akeem if he is truly willing to give up his kingdom for her, and with a brilliant, loving smile, he replies, "No." Coming to America is a triumphant, beautifully crafted masterpiece that balances laugh-out-loud comedy with a deeply resonant exploration of human dignity. Its strengths lie in its incredible performances, its rich cultural pride, and its refusal to rely on cheap, mean-spirited humor. Its only minor flaw is a slightly padded second act, but that pacing allows the central romance to feel entirely earned rather than rushed. Compared to other classic 80s comedies like Trading Places or Arthur, which explore wealth through a lens of cynicism, Coming to America stands out for its profound optimism and warmth. It is a definitive 10 out of 10 cinematic treasure, a glowing reminder that no matter how many walls, titles, or societal expectations surround us, the greatest kingdom we can ever conquer is the one inside our own hearts. The profound resonance of this journey doesn't simply end when the credits roll. It forces us to look closer at the intricate psychological architecture of the characters we've just spent time with. When you strip away the spectacular musical numbers and the unforgettable comedic banter, Coming to America reveals itself to be a deeply layered character study about breaking free from systemic conditioning. Consider Prince Akeem's internal world. He isn't just a wealthy man looking for a girlfriend. He is a structural dissident within his own utopian society. Every single luxury provided to him in Zamunda is designed to erode his autonomy, to make him soft, dependent, and easily controlled by the weight of ancient traditions. His decision to move to Queens and deliberately seek out manual labor is an act of radical psychological reconditioning. By plunging his hands into dishwater and sweeping up filth, Akeem is systematically dismantling the artificial hierarchy that has defined his entire reality. He is proving to himself that his worth is intrinsic, not inherited. Contrast this with Semi, whose psychological armor is entirely tethered to the external validation of the royal court. Semi is the perfect embodiment of institutionalization. He doesn't crave freedom because freedom requires accountability, vulnerability, and discomfort. When forced into the harsh, unglamorous reality of a New York winter, Semi's immediate instinct is to cheat the system, to recreate the golden cage because the vacuum of anonymity terrifies him. The dynamic between Akeem and Semi beautifully mirrors the classic philosophical struggle between growth and security. Akeem is willing to suffer to discover his true self, whereas Semi is willing to surrender his individuality to maintain his comfort. This friction is what gives their partnership such brilliant narrative weight, elevating their comedic bickering into a fascinating debate on human nature. Then we have Lisa McDowell, who serves as the emotional and moral anchor of the entire narrative. In many traditional romantic comedies of the era, the female lead exists merely as a prize to be won, a passive object for the protagonist's desires. But Lisa is fiercely countercultural. She is a woman caught between two conflicting pressures: her father's desperate, aggressive obsession with upward social mobility and her own desire for authentic, respectful love. When she rejects Daryl Jenks, she isn't just dumping a boyfriend. She is rejecting a lifestyle of superficial branding and toxic entitlement. Her attraction to Akeem is rooted entirely in his emotional intelligence and his radical humility. The true tragedy of the film's second act twist is that when Akeem's royal identity is exposed, it weaponizes Lisa's worst fears against her. She suddenly feels like a pawn in a wealthy man's simulation, a temporary project for a prince experiencing how the other half lives. Her anger is entirely justified, and it elevates the film's narrative stakes from a simple misunderstanding to a profound crisis of trust and emotional integrity.
This brings us to the masterful visual and technical language that John Landis uses to communicate these heavy psychological shifts. The cinematography by Woody Omans operates on a binary system of scales that directly affects the audience's emotional state. When we are in Zamunda, the camera movements are sweeping, smooth, and rigidly symmetrical, mimicking the unyielding, clockwork perfection of the royal court. The framing is wide, emphasizing the vast, intimidating spaces of the palace where individual humans look small against the backdrop of absolute power. But the moment the story lands in New York, the camera style transforms completely. The framing becomes tight, intimate, and gritty. Landis utilizes natural lighting, capturing the harsh fluorescent glow of McDowell's, the dim shadows of the Queen's apartment, and the soft, falling snow under street lamps. This technical shift makes the romance feel incredibly visceral and close to the skin. We aren't watching a fairy tale anymore. We are watching real life unfold in real time, which makes the stakes feel entirely immediate. Furthermore, the legendary costume design by Deborah Nadelman Landis plays a massive, unspoken role in the storytelling. The garments in Zamunda are a breathtaking celebration of African royalty, utilizing rich, heavy textiles, intricate embroidery, and massive furs that project an aura of unshakable majesty and cultural pride. But notice how Akeem's clothing evolves throughout his time in New York. He transitions from these overwhelming, structured royal garments into basic, mass-produced working-class attire, overalls, beanies, and a standard-issue McDowell's uniform. This visual stripping away of his status allows his internal light to shine through completely. It forces the viewer to look directly at Eddie Murphy's expressive, nuanced performance rather than the grandeur surrounding him. By the time Akeem is wearing a cheap, stained apron while smiling genuinely at Lisa, the costume design has successfully completed his transformation from an untouchable symbol into a real, relatable man. Underneath the brilliant narrative structure and technical execution, the movie functions as an incredibly sharp piece of social commentary and symbolism. The counterfeit nature of McDowell's restaurant is a brilliant metaphor for the American dream itself. Cleo McDowell is obsessed with copying a megacorporation, changing just enough details to avoid a lawsuit, believing that if he mimics the external signs of success, he will achieve true happiness and security. He is a man running on a capitalist treadmill, completely blind to the fact that his obsession with wealth is eroding his family's emotional well-being. This stands in beautiful contrast to the Zamundan royal family, who already possess all the wealth in the world but are completely stagnant culturally. The film uses food, status symbols, and economic disparity to show that whether you are a king in an African palace or a business owner in Queens, the human trap remains exactly the same, confusing your material possessions with your actual soul. When we evaluate Coming to America within the broader context of cinema history, its cultural impact is absolutely monumental. It proved to Hollywood that an almost entirely black cast could lead a high-budget, mainstream romantic comedy to historic worldwide box office success without sacrificing cultural specificity or universal emotional appeal. It balanced sharp, urban wit with a timeless, Shakespearean narrative structure, creating an experience that feels simultaneously contemporary and ancient. The film's strengths are undeniable, from its flawless packing and iconic dialogue to the legendary, chameleonic performances of Murphy and Hall across multiple roles that set a new benchmark for comedic acting. If there is a critique to be made, It is that the ultimate resolution in the third act relies on a somewhat sudden shift in King Jaffar's rigid worldview. But this shift is executed with such immense emotional warmth that it feels entirely satisfying rather than contrived. Ultimately, Coming to America endures as a masterclass in cinematic storytelling because it understands that the ultimate luxury in life isn't gold, servants, or a royal title. The ultimate luxury is the freedom to choose your own destiny, to look into the eyes of another person and know that they see you, validate you, and love you entirely for who you are when all the masks are taken away. It is a cinematic experience that fills your heart just as much as it makes you laugh, leaving an indelible mark on the soul long after the final frame fades to black. It remains an absolute, undeniable landmark of popular culture, earning a perfect, well-deserved 10 out of 10 for its brilliant humor, its deep humanity, and its timeless celebration of the courage it takes to find your own way in the world. To truly understand why this narrative continues to dominate our collective cultural consciousness decades after its initial release, we have to look past the surface-level plot mechanics and dive straight into the profound subtext embedded within the film's final act. The resolution of Coming to America isn't just a convenient, feel-good ending slapped onto a romantic comedy to send the audience home happy. It is a radical thematic statement about the evolution of tradition and the breaking of generational curses. When King Jafar stands in that cramped, chaotic New York apartment, surrounded by the physical remnants of his son's deliberate poverty, he isn't just looking at a rebellious kid who ran away from home. He is confronting the reality that the ancient, unyielding structures he spent his entire life protecting are fundamentally hollow if they require the emotional suffocating of the people he loves most. The psychological shift within the king is the true, hidden climax of the movie. James Earl Jones plays this transition with a magnificent, understated subtlety. For the first two-thirds of the film, his voice is a booming instrument of absolute law. It brooks no argument, allows no compromise, and treats human emotion as a minor inconvenience to be managed by royal decree. But when he returns to Zamunda, after seeing the fierce, unbought dignity of Lisa McDowell, a woman who looked a literal king in the eye and refused to surrender her self-respect for a crown, something shifts permanently in his worldview. He realizes that the modern world cannot be kept at bay by high palace walls and rigid matrimonial laws. True royalty isn't defined by the gold on your robes, but by the capacity of your heart to expand, adapt, and honor the humanity of others. When he ultimately changes the law to allow Akeem to marry for love, it represents a monumental victory of human agency over institutional stagnation. This brings us to a deeper analysis of the film's handling of the immigrant experience, a layer that often gets overshadowed by the broader comedic elements. Akeem and Semi's arrival in Queens mirrors the classic American immigrant narrative, but with a brilliant, satirical twist. They are not coming to America out of economic desperation. They are coming out of spiritual starvation. Yet the challenges they face, the hostility of the environment, the initial isolation, the necessity of taking low-wage, unglamorous jobs, and the struggle to understand a completely foreign social landscape, are deeply authentic. By framing a wealthy African prince as a humble immigrant worker, the film subtly and beautifully humanizes a demographic that Hollywood historically pushed to the margins or treated with xenophobic condescension. Akeem doesn't survive in New York because of his royal privilege. He thrives because of his innate work ethic, his bottomless optimism, and his genuine desire to integrate into the fabric of the community. The relationship between Lisa and her father, Cleo McDowell, also serves as a brilliant counterweight to the royal family dynamics in Zamunda. John Amos delivers a performance of incredible comedic energy, but underneath the loud laughs, Cleo represents a very specific, deeply American anxiety. He is a black businessman who has fought tooth and nail to establish a foothold in a competitive, capitalist society. His obsession with status symbols, his desperate desire to see his daughter marry into the wealthy Jenks family, and his hilarious imitation of a major corporate entity are all coping mechanisms born out of a fear of falling back into poverty. When he discovers Akeem is a prince, his immediate, manic shift from dismissive boss to sycophantic servant is incredibly funny, but it's also a biting critique of how capitalistic societies value people entirely based on their net worth. It takes Lisa's uncompromising moral clarity to anchor the family, proving that the true wealth of the McDowell household lies in their bond, not the branding of their restaurant. From a cinematic and technical standpoint, the editing and comedic packing of Coming to America deserve an immense amount of historical credit. Editor Malcolm Campbell balances two wildly divergent tones without ever causing narrative whiplash. On one hand, you have the slow, elegant, dialogue-driven romance between Akeem and Lisa that requires patience and atmospheric stillness. On the other, you have the high-energy, rapid-fire improvisational set pieces in the barbershop and the local church, where Eddie Murphy and Arsenio Hall are allowed to completely cut loose. The transitions between these spaces feel completely organic because Landis anchors every single scene in a concrete sense of place. You can practically feel the freezing chill of the New York air outside the apartment, just as you can smell the heavy hair product and stale coffee inside Clarence's barbershop. The environment isn't just a background. It is an active character that shapes how the protagonists behave and react. Let's also talk about the brilliant musical landscape curated by composer Nile Rodgers. The soundtrack is an absolute masterclass in cultural synthesis. It blends traditional, epic orchestral arrangements that evoke the sweeping majesty of Zamunda with the cutting-edge, vibrant urban sounds of late 80s R&B, funk, and early hip-hop. The music acts as a sonic bridge between two completely different worlds, preparing the audience's ears for the eventual merging of Akeem and Lisa's lives. When the legendary theme song hits, it carries an infectious, celebratory energy that perfectly encapsulates the film's overarching spirit of joy, pride, and romantic triumph. It's an auditory representation of freedom, perfectly matching Akeem's internal liberation as he steps away from the stifling silence of the palace and into the loud, beautiful chaos of the real world. When you look at the film's weaknesses, they are remarkably few and far between, especially when viewed through the lens of late 1980s cinema. Some might argue that the depiction of the fictional kingdom of Zamunda relies heavily on an idealized, almost fairy tale version of African royalty that glosses over geopolitical realities. However, this artistic choice was entirely deliberate and deeply revolutionary for its time. By presenting a sovereign, wildly wealthy, hyper-advanced African nation completely untouched by colonialism, Landis and Murphy created a visual blueprint for black excellence and cinematic escapism that paved the way for modern masterpieces like Black Panther. It wasn't meant to be a documentary. It was meant to be a mythic kingdom where a young man's moral character could be tested against the corrupting influence of absolute power. Ultimately, Coming to America stands as a monumental pillar of cinematic history because it dares to believe in the absolute best of human nature. It argues that love, when it is pure and unvarnished, has the power to bridge vast economic divides, break down ancient, unyielding legal structures, and heal the deep-seated psychological wounds of isolation. It shows us that the ultimate journey of life isn't about climbing to the top of a mountain to claim a throne, but about having the courage to step down from that mountain, pick up a mop, and walk side by side with humanity. It is an enduring, deeply moving celebration of identity, dignity, and the boundless power of love to redefine who we are. For its incredible heart, its timeless social relevance, and its ability to make us laugh hysterically while crying tears of genuine joy, it cements its place in the cinematic pantheon as an absolute, flawless 10 out of 10 masterpiece that will continue to inspire and entertain generations of film lovers for centuries to come. To delve even further into the profound cinematic architecture of this narrative, we must examine how it masterfully handles its secondary characters to reinforce its core psychological themes. A perfect example of this is the character of Patris McDowell, Lisa's younger sister, played with a brilliant, calculating energy by Alison Dean. While Lisa represents the idealized pursuit of authentic, spiritual love, Patris embodies the immediate material temptations of the era. She is drawn instantly to external signifiers of wealth and power, showing an initial, aggressive interest in Akeem when she assumes he is just a wealthy foreigner, and later pivoting her attention towards Semi when he begins flaunting cash. Patris isn't written as a villain, but rather as a highly realistic product of her environment, a young woman navigating a hypercapitalistic society where financial security is constantly equated with personal worth. By contrasting Patris's materialistic worldview with Lisa's deeply rooted moral integrity, the script quietly validates Lisa's eventual choice, proving that true romantic fulfillment cannot be bought, bartered, or negotiated through financial transactions. This thematic contrast is echoed beautifully in the character of Queen Aelian, played with a breathtaking, regal grace by Madge Sinclair. While King Jafar represents the unyielding, rigid hand of law and tradition, the Queen embodies the intuitive, emotional intelligence of the Zamundin crown. Throughout the film, her silent observations speak volumes. She watches her son's profound unhappiness, not with the detached concern of a monarch, but with the deep, aching empathy of a mother who understands that a golden cage is still a cage. When the royal court arrives in the stark, unglamorous environment of Queens, New York, it is the Queen who first recognizes the genuine emotional depth of Akeem's transformation. Her subtle, commanding interventions, often delivered with just a single, pointed look toward her husband, serve as the critical catalyst for the king's eventual change of heart. The creative chemistry between Madge Sinclair and James Earl Jones, who famously worked together across multiple iconic projects, lends a profound sense of history, weight, and matriarchal balance to the story, ensuring that the resolution feels like a balanced evolution of a family rather than a sudden, unearned political capitulation. On a purely technical and cinematic level, the film's utilization of sound design and environmental audio deserves a massive amount of analytical praise. When the story resides in Zamunda, the audio landscape is clean, pristine, and perfectly mixed. The background noises are limited to the gentle chirping of exotic birds, the crisp rustle of silk robes, and the synchronized movements of servants. It is an auditory environment of absolute control, where unexpected sounds simply do not exist. But the moment Akeem and Semi step out of their yellow cab in New York City, the audio track explodes into a chaotic, overwhelming wall of sound. The relentless, screeching brakes of subway trains, the distant, echoing wails of sirens, the loud, overlapping arguments of street vendors, and the heavy thump of boomboxes create an immediate, visceral sense of sensory overload. Director John Landis uses this aggressive sound design to simulate Akeem's internal psychological shock. He is no longer insulated from the world. He is entirely immersed in its messy, vibrant, unpredictable heartbeat. This auditory chaos makes his ability to find peace, clarity, and genuine romantic connection in the middle of Queens feel all the more triumphant and miraculous. Furthermore, the film's brilliant subversion of the traditional fish-out-of-water trope is what keeps the narrative momentum moving at such a breakneck, engaging pace. In lesser hands, a story about a wealthy prince working a fast food job would rely heavily on cheap jokes at the protagonist's expense, painting him as incompetent, clumsy, or fundamentally soft. But Coming to America completely flips this expectation on its head. Akeem is shockingly adept at his menial tasks because he approaches them with the absolute focus, discipline, and dedication of a martial artist. When he wields a mop or wipes down a table, He does so with an elegant, almost choreographic precision that completely baffles his employer, Cleo McDowell. This creative choice keeps the audience firmly rooted in Akeem's corner. We aren't laughing at his degradation, we are cheering for his humility. His dignity remains entirely intact because his self-worth was never derived from the job itself, but from the purity of his intent. It is a profound philosophical statement disguised as a light-hearted workplace comedy, reminding the viewer that there is immense nobility in all forms of honest labor when it is performed with a generous, joyful spirit. When we look back at the historical legacy of this masterpiece, it is impossible to ignore how it fundamentally altered the trajectory of Eddie Murphy's career and established him as an absolute auteur of modern comedy. Prior to this film, Murphy was primarily known for his fast-talking, street-smart, somewhat cynical personas in high-octane action comedies. With Coming to America, he dared to play the straight man, a gentle, soft-spoken, profoundly romantic optimist who allows the chaotic world around him to generate the humor. It was an incredibly risky creative pivot that required immense artistic maturity and vulnerability. By anchoring the film with Akeem's sincere, beating heart while simultaneously venting his explosive comedic energy through the prosthetic characters of Clarence, Saul, and Randy Watson, Murphy delivered a multi-layered, tour-de-force performance that redefined the boundaries of what a comedic lead could achieve. It proved that a film could be wildly, unapologetically funny, while still maintaining an uncompromising commitment to genuine human emotion, narrative depth, and cinematic beauty. It remains an enduring, timeless triumph of storytelling, a glowing testament to the power of cinema to uplift our spirits, challenge our societal prejudices, and remind us that the ultimate crown we can ever wear is the one forged by our own integrity, kindness, and love. To fully appreciate the narrative mastery at play, we must deconstruct the film's brilliant use of situational irony, particularly through the unforgettable character of Randy Watson and his fictional soul band, Sexual Chocolate. Played with agonizingly funny perfection by Eddie Murphy in heavy prosthetics, Randy Watson is a local Queens celebrity who has peaked in his own mind. When he takes the stage at the Black Awareness Week pageant, draped in a blindingly bright, synthetic velour suit, his performance is a masterclass in diluted grandeur. He sings with desperate, off-key passion, dropping his mic with an unearned theatrical flourish, completely oblivious to the fact that the audience is trapped in an awkward, stone-faced silence. The psychological positioning of this scene is pure genius. Right there in the crowd, watching this spectacle of desperate manufactured vanity, sits Prince Akeem, a man who actually possesses the immense status and adoration Randy Watson is so desperately trying to fake. Yet, Akeem doesn't look at Randy with mockery or aristocratic disdain. Instead, he watches with a gentle, appreciative smile, utterly captivated by the raw, unpolished humanity of the event. This moment beautifully highlights Akeem's internal transformation. He has traveled from a world where everything is perfect but utterly soulless, to a world where everything is deeply flawed but completely alive. Randy Watson isn't just a hilarious comedic detour. He is a walking symbol of the superficial validation Akeem is actively trying to escape. This brings us to a closer examination of the film's structural packing, which mirrors the classic hero's journey with astonishing fidelity. The first act in Zamunda acts as the ordinary world, a place of stagnant comfort where the hero feels an undeniable call to adventure. The dirty, chaotic streets of Queens represent the crossing of the first threshold, a hostile new environment where all of Akeem's old rules of survival no longer apply. The middle section of the film functions as the road of trials, where our prince must face the grueling, unglamorous tests of manual labor, economic scarcity, and the emotional threat of a wealthy rival. What makes this journey so incredibly satisfying for an audience to watch is that Akeem's weapon of choice isn't a sword, a shield, or a bag of gold. His weapon is his unwavering, radical politeness. In a city famous for its thick skin, sharp elbows, and defensive cynicism, Akeem's pure, unfiltered kindness acts like a psychological disruptor. When a neighbor screams an incredibly vulgar insult at him from across the street, Akeem simply smiles, waves, and yells the exact same vulgarity back with genuine, heartwarming enthusiasm, completely rewriting the toxic energy of the environment. He doesn't conquer New York by changing it. He conquers it by letting it change him, proving that true strength lies in vulnerability and an open heart. If we look at the film's climax through a modern psychological lens, the ultimate confrontation between Akeem's traditional upbringing and his newfound independence offers a profound commentary on generational trauma and parental expectations. King Jafar's aggressive intervention in Queens isn't born out of hatred for his son. It is driven by a deep, paralyzing fear of the unknown. To the king, the rigid traditions of Zamunda are the only thing keeping his family secure and his kingdom stable. He views Akeem's desire for an authentic, self-chosen life as a dangerous form of madness that threatens to unravel centuries of carefully preserved history. When Lisa McDowell walks away from Akeem after discovering his royal lie, she forces both the prince and the king to confront a brutal truth. You cannot build a meaningful future on a foundation of deception, no matter how noble your intentions might be. Lisa's refusal to be swept off her feet by the mere revelation of wealth and royalty is the ultimate reality check for the Zamundan court. She demands to be seen as an equal, a person with her own agency and right to the truth, completely shattering the ancient, patriarchal assumption that a crown cures all problems. From a technical perspective, the film's visual transitions during the third act are executed with an exquisite emotional intelligence. As Akeem is forced back onto the royal transport to return home, director John Landis deliberately drains the vibrant, street-level energy of New York from the frame. The close-up shots that defined Akeem and Lisa's intimate walks are replaced once again by distant, cold, static compositions. The interior of the royal jet is silent, clinical, and claustrophobic, contrasting sharply with the loud, chaotic, but deeply affectionate world they left behind in Queens. This visual regression makes the audience feel the exact same crushing sense of defeat that Akeem is experiencing. He has been forced back into his golden cage, and the silence inside that palace has never felt louder or more suffocating. Yet it is precisely this emotional rock bottom that sets the stage for the film's magnificent, tear-jerking resolution. By the time we reach the royal wedding in Zamunda, the film has perfectly earned its sweeping, operatic finale. When Lisa lifts her veil at the altar, it isn't just a victory for romance. It is a monumental triumph of human spirit over systemic conditioning. Akeem didn't have to sacrifice his heritage to find his happiness, and Lisa didn't have to lose her independence to become a queen. Together, they create a new paradigm, proving that the most powerful traditions are the ones we choose to build ourselves, rooted in mutual respect, uncompromising honesty, and an enduring commitment to love each other for exactly who we are. To truly grasp the cinematic longevity of this narrative, we must unpack the layer of the film that acts as its silent engine, the incredible subversion of economic and class dynamics. In the vast majority of classic Hollywood storytelling, wealth is positioned as the ultimate reward, the happily ever after that resolves all conflicts. If a character starts poor, the narrative arc dictates that they must climb the socioeconomic ladder to find validation. Coming to America boldly takes this paradigm and flips it entirely on its head. Wealth in Zamunda is presented not as a triumph, but as a profound psychological sedative. It is an opiate that numbs the soul, strips away personal accountability, and reduces human relationships to transaction and protocol. By forcing the audience to watch a man actively flee from unlimited resources into a life of minimum wage labor, the film forces us to re-examine our own relationship with the American dream. We are forced to ask ourselves, If unlimited wealth cannot buy a sense of purpose, an authentic identity, or true love, then what exactly are we spending our entire lives chasing? This existential questioning is wrapped in the brilliant, accessible packaging of a late 80s studio comedy, allowing its radical message to slide effortlessly into the subconscious of the mainstream viewer. This brilliant thematic subversion is perfectly mirrored in the character of Cleo McDowell, whose internal psychology provides a stark, fascinating contrast to Prince Akeem's journey. Cleo is a man who has bought into the external illusion of the American dream hook, line, and sinker. He is trapped in a state of perpetual, hypervigilant paranoia, constantly terrified that the fast food empire he has built with his bare hands will be torn down by a McDonald's lawsuit or ruined by a bad economic turn. When he looks at Daryl Jenks, he doesn't see a toxic, arrogant narcissist who treats his daughter like a possession. He sees a financial safety net. He sees a merger. The tragic comedy of Cleo's character is that he is entirely blind to the true royalty standing right in front of him in a grease-stained apron. Akeem, who has never had to worry about money a single day in his life, possesses the very things Cleo's wealth could never buy: an unshakable, calm peace of mind, a profound respect for human dignity, and a completely open heart. When Cleo eventually discovers Akeem's true identity, his manic, hysterical transformation into a fawning royal courtier is incredibly funny, but it carries a sharp, biting edge of social critique. It shows how easily human beings will compromise their own dignity when confronted with the blinding light of extreme wealth and power. On a deeper directorial level, John Landis handles the spatial geography of the film with an absolute masterclass in psychological framing. Pay close attention to how doors and windows are utilized throughout the New York segments of the story. In Akeem and Semi's dilapidated apartment, the windows are broken, covered in grime, and looking out onto a chaotic, violent street. Yet, Akeem spends a massive amount of time leaning out of those windows, smiling at the screaming neighbors, taking in the freezing air, and actively trying to connect with the world outside. He wants the barrier between himself and humanity to be completely shattered. Now look at the McDowell household or Daryl Jenks' luxury vehicle. The windows are always closed, the doors are locked, and the environments are heavily insulated from the surrounding neighborhood. Daryl lives his life in a sterile, climate-controlled bubble of hair grease and economic privilege, completely cut off from the vibrant, living pulse of the community he inhabits. This visual motif subtly tells the audience everything they need to know about the characters' moral trajectories. Akeem is a man expanding outward, tearing down walls to find his truth, while the people around him are busy building walls to keep the real world at bay. Furthermore, the film's incredible handling of its female characters deserves a massive amount of modern historical recognition. In an era of cinema where women in comedies were frequently reduced to hypersexualized set dressing or passive rewards for the male protagonist's ego, Coming to America presents a world populated by deeply autonomous, strong-willed women. Lisa McDowell is the absolute moral North Star of the film. She isn't swept away by romantic gestures. She is driven by a desire for respect, substance, and intellectual partnership. When she ultimately travels all the way to Zamunda to stand at that altar, she isn't doing it because she wants to be a princess. She is doing it because she realized that Akeem's willingness to strip away his entire identity just to know her was the ultimate act of genuine, unvarnished devotion. Even the arranged bride back in Zamunda, who initially appears to be a mindless servant doing whatever she is told, is used as a mirror to shock Akeem into action, highlighting the fundamental horror of a society that treats human beings as blank slates to be written on by royal decree. When we take a step back and look at the macro-level impact of this film, we see a piece of art that managed to capture lightning in a bottle. It is a movie that functions simultaneously as a massive commercial blockbuster, a culture-shifting milestone for representation, a genuinely touching romance, and an absolute clinic in character-driven comedy. Its strengths lie in its deep, unapologetic warmth, its refusal to rely on mean-spirited or punch-down humor, and its total commitment to the emotional reality of its characters. It understands that for comedy to truly resonate on a timeless scale, the audience must care deeply about the people telling the jokes. By grounding Eddie Murphy's explosive, chameleonic genius in a story about a young man's desperate, beautiful search for his own soul, John Landis created a cinematic treasure that transcends the era of its creation. It is a shining, indelible reminder that the ultimate measure of a person isn't found in the titles they inherit, the clothes they wear, or the amount of money in their bank account. It is found in the courage it takes to look past the illusions of status, step down into the messy, beautiful chaos of real life, and love another human being with complete, uncompromising honesty. It is a definitive, timeless 10 out of 10 masterpiece that will continue to warm hearts and inspire minds as long as movies are projected on a screen. To fully unpack the structural brilliance of the narrative's final moments, we have to look closely at the profound psychological transformation of King Jafar, a man who represents the absolute apex of unyielding institutional authority. When the king initially lands in Queens, New York, he isn't just entering a different country. He is stepping into an entirely foreign psychological dimension. In Zamunda, his word is cosmic law. If he commands a person to bark like a dog, they bark. But New York City doesn't care about his royal lineage. The city treats him with the exact same gritty, unbothered indifference that it treats everyone else. This cultural clash is beautifully highlighted when the king attempts to buy off the McDowell family, operating under the deeply ingrained assumption that every human being has a price tag, and that integrity is merely a commodity waiting to be negotiated. The king's true awakening happens not during a grand political speech, but in the quiet, devastating aftermath of Lisa McDowell's rejection of his son. When Lisa walks out into the pouring rain, leaving Prince Akeem standing entirely broken on the pavement, King Jafar is forced to witness something his immense wealth had never allowed him to see before: the limits of absolute power. He realizes that all the gold in his treasury, all the land in his kingdom, and all the royal decrees in his arsenal cannot compel a single human heart to love his son. For a ruler obsessed with absolute control, this realization is an immense psychological shock. It shatters his worldview, forcing him to understand that the rigid traditions he spent his life protecting are fundamentally hollow if they strip away the genuine humanity, happiness, and autonomy of the very people he loves most. This profound realization sets up the magnificent, operatic climax of the royal wedding in Zamunda, a sequence that serves as an absolute masterclass in visual storytelling, emotional misdirection, and cinematic release. As the scene begins, director John Landis deliberately bathes the palace in a cold, suffocating formality that mirrors the film's opening frames. Akeem stands at the altar, his face a completely blank mask of absolute resignation. He has surrendered his personal dreams, accepted his duty, and resigned himself to a lifetime of hollow protocol, believing that his incredible journey to America was nothing more than a beautiful, transient illusion. The audience feels a crushing sense of defeat alongside him as the heavily veiled bride slowly marches down the long, symmetrical aisle to the sound of traditional royal horns. But the moment the bride reaches the altar and slowly lifts her veil, the film delivers one of the most emotionally satisfying, triumphant reveals in cinema history. It is Lisa. The screen instantly erupts with a brilliant, overwhelming warmth as the cold formality of the palace is completely shattered by genuine human joy. This twist is incredibly powerful because it is entirely earned through character growth rather than cheap narrative trickery. Lisa didn't travel across the globe because she suddenly coveted a royal title. She did it because she finally recognized the absolute purity of Akeem's devotion. She realized that a man willing to mop floors, live in a freezing slum, and strip away his entire identity just to win her heart based on his character alone was a man worth walking across the world for. The final exchange between the newlywed couple as they wave to the cheering crowds of Zamunda provides a perfect, brilliantly witty summation of the film's core themes. As they look out over the vast, beautiful kingdom they will one day rule together, Lisa playfully asks Akeem if he is truly willing to give up his entire empire just for her. With a magnificent, loving smile, Akeem looks at her and replies, "No." It's a hilarious, pitch-perfect punchline that keeps the movie firmly rooted in its comedic identity. But beneath the laughter, it carries a profound philosophical weight. It signals to the audience that Akeem didn't have to destroy his heritage to find his freedom, and Lisa didn't have to sacrifice her fierce independence to become a queen. By choosing each other on a foundation of absolute equality, honesty, and mutual respect, they have successfully redefined what royalty means, paving the way for a brand new, enlightened era for their kingdom. When we evaluate Coming to America within the broader context of late 20th century cinema, its cultural legacy and artistic achievement are absolutely monumental. At a time when mainstream Hollywood was deeply hesitant to fund high-budget, premium projects led by almost entirely black casts, Eddie Murphy and John Landis crafted a massive worldwide blockbuster that grossed nearly $300 million and completely revolutionized industry expectations. The film refused to rely on cheap, mean-spirited stereotypes or cynical humor. Instead, it presented a breathtakingly beautiful, vibrant, and dignified vision of an uncolonized African paradise that served as a direct visual blueprint for modern cultural masterpieces like Black Panther. It balanced sharp, contemporary urban wit with a timeless, classic fairy tale structure, creating an enduring cinematic experience that continues to resonate across generations, cultures, and decades. The film's strengths are nearly flawless, driven by the historic, chameleonic performances of Eddie Murphy and Arsenio Hall across multiple legendary roles that permanently set a new benchmark for comedic acting. If there is any minor critique to be made, it is that the ultimate packing of the second act slows down slightly to allow the central romance to breathe. But this deliberate choice is precisely why the emotional stakes feel so incredibly real and close to the skin by the time the third act arrives. Compared to other iconic 80s comedies that viewed wealth and status through a lens of biting cynicism, Coming to America stands out as a glowing beacon of profound optimism, warm human empathy, and unwavering respect for individual dignity. Ultimately, this cinematic treasure endures because it reminds us of a universal human truth that we so easily forget in our hypermaterialistic world. The ultimate kingdom we can ever conquer is the one inside our own hearts. It is a triumphant, beautifully crafted 10 out of 10 masterpiece that fills your soul with joy just as much as it makes you laugh hysterically, leaving an indelible, heartwarming mark on the viewer long after the final frame fades to black. It remains a definitive landmark of popular culture, a timeless celebration of the immense courage it takes to step away from the safety of expectations, look past the illusions of status, and forge your own path toward a life defined by authentic, uncompromising love. To truly appreciate how this film continues to operate as an absolute powerhouse of modern entertainment, we must look beyond the immediate narrative structure and dissect the incredible legacy of its physical production. The late 1980s was an era where practical effects, physical sets, and tangible craftsmanship reigned supreme, and Coming to America stands as one of the ultimate monuments to this golden age of Hollywood production. When you look at the Grand Palace of Zamunda, you aren't looking at a green screen illusion or a digital rendering cooked up in a computer lab. You are looking at massive, meticulously constructed physical sets built on the legendary soundstages of Paramount Pictures. The staggering attention to detail, from the hand-carved pillars and gilded thrones to the cascading indoor water features, creates a heavy, palpable sense of reality that completely alters how the actors carry themselves within the space. This commitment to physical world building is precisely why the film feels so incredibly cinematic and timeless. When James Earl Jones or Madge Sinclair glide through those hallways, the environment naturally commands a specific posture, a slow, deliberate cadence of movement that instantly communicates centuries of unshakable history and royal heritage. Then, when the production shifts to the frozen streets of Queens, New York, the cinematic language undergoes a deliberate, grounding transformation. The filmmakers didn't attempt to recreate New York on a backlot. They took the cast and crew into the bitter, unvarnished winter air of the actual outer boroughs. The dirty snowbanks, the biting wind that causes the actor's breath to fog heavily in front of the camera, and the authentic, crowded architecture of the neighborhood provide a gritty, unfiltered counterweight to the pristine luxury of the first act. This visceral contrast is a technical masterclass, ensuring that the audience doesn't just see the shift in Akeem's world, they completely feel it in their bones. At the very center of this technical triumph sits the revolutionary work of special makeup, effects creator Rick Baker, whose contributions to this film permanently shifted the paradigm of comedic acting and character transformation. Prior to coming to America, heavy prosthetic makeup was almost entirely reserved for the horror and sci-fi genres, used to create monsters, aliens, and disfigured villains. The idea of using hyper-realistic, medical-grade prosthetics to create distinct, grounded comedic characters within a contemporary romantic narrative was an incredibly bold, uncharted creative risk. Baker and his team spent countless hours casting molds of Eddie Murphy and Arsenio Hall's faces, meticulously sculpting entirely new facial structures, wrinkles, and skin textures out of foam latex. The result was an absolute miracle of cinematic illusion. When Murphy transforms into Saul, the elderly Jewish man who sits in the local barbershop arguing about boxing, the transformation is so absolute, so structurally perfect, that audiences in 1988 frequently had no idea they were looking at a 26-year-old black superstar at the peak of his fame. Saul isn't played as a caricature or a cartoonish sketch. He is written and performed with a magnificent, lived-in humanity that feels entirely authentic to the fabric of New York City life. The prosthetics didn't hinder Murphy's performance, they liberated it. By completely obscuring his famous visage, Baker's makeup allowed Murphy to fully submerge his ego into these secondary roles, adjusting his vocal pitch, his physical posture, and his comedic timing to match the exact psychology of each distinct character. This multi-role format wasn't just a flashy gimmick. It was a profound showcase of artistic versatility that added a rich, multi-layered texture to the community surrounding Akeem, making the neighborhood feel incredibly alive, diverse, and steeped in its own rich oral history. Furthermore, we must analyze the incredible subtext of the film's costume design, an element that acts as a silent but immensely powerful engine for character development. Designed by the visionary Deborah Nadelman Landis, the wardrobe in Coming to America functions as a brilliant, visual map of the characters' internal motivations and psychological evolutions. In the Kingdom of Zamunda, the costumes are an unapologetic, jaw-dropping celebration of absolute sovereignty. They utilize a breathtaking palette of royal jewel tones, deep sapphires, rich emeralds, and brilliant golds, interwoven with heavy, luxurious silks, intricate hand-woven embroideries, and massive, sweeping furs that project an aura of total majesty. These garments are intentionally designed to look incredibly heavy and restrictive, subtly communicating to the audience that the characters are physically bound by the rigid weight of their titles and traditions. But notice what happens to the visual language of the clothing when Akeem and Semi arrive in New York. To fully immerse himself in the human experience, Akeem deliberately strips away his royal wardrobe, packing his gold-threaded robes into suitcases and locking them away. He transitions into basic, off-the-rack, working-class American attire, heavy woolen beanies, oversized thrift store coats, and eventually, the stark, mass-produced polyester uniform of a McDowell's employee. This deliberate stripping away of his physical status is a brilliant cinematic device. It forces the viewer to focus entirely on the warmth of Akim's eyes, the gentleness of his expressions, and the inherent nobility of his actions rather than the material wealth that once surrounded him. Conversely, look at Semi's wardrobe choices throughout the New York segment. Semi is a character desperately clinging to the external validation of his status. Even when forced to live in a rundown apartment, he refuses to completely let go of the luxury, choosing to wear high-end, tailored Western suits and expensive leather coats that look completely absurd and out of place in the gritty, blue-collar environment of Queens. This subtle visual friction constantly reinforces their central psychological conflict. Akim is using his clothing to blend into humanity, while Semi is desperately using his wardrobe to separate himself from it. When we take a step back and examine Coming to America within the macro context of cinema history, its enduring legacy as an absolute masterpiece becomes undeniable. It is a film that successfully achieved the ultimate hat trick of commercial filmmaking. It was a massive, culture-shifting box office juggernaut that shattered systemic industry prejudices, a deeply affecting and emotionally grounded romance that defied the cynical tropes of its era, and an absolutely legendary showcase of character-driven comedic genius that remains endlessly quotable decades later. Its true strength lies in its profound, unwavering commitment to human warmth. John Landis and Eddie Murphy understood a fundamental truth about storytelling that many modern filmmakers have completely forgotten. For comedy to truly stand the test of time, for it to linger in the hearts of an audience for generations, it cannot be rooted in cruelty, mockery, or mean-spirited cynicism. The humor must flow naturally out of the characters' flaws, their contradictions, and their genuine, deeply relatable desires for connection, love, and autonomy. By grounding Eddie Murphy's explosive, chameleonic energy in the story of a gentle, soft-spoken prince who is willing to give up everything just to find a woman who loves him for exactly who he is when the crown is removed, the filmmakers created a timeless piece of cinematic magic. It is a movie that fills your heart with an overwhelming sense of joy and optimism, just as much as it makes you laugh hysterically, leaving an permanent, deeply comforting mark on the soul long after the final frame fades to black. It remains a definitive, monumental 10 out of 10 landmark of popular culture, a brilliant, glowing reminder that no matter what titles society forces us to wear, what expectations surround us, or what walls we build to protect ourselves, the ultimate and most rewarding kingdom we can ever hope to conquer is the one forged by our own kindness, our own integrity, and our own capacity to love with a completely open and uncompromising heart. To truly appreciate how this film continues to operate as an absolute powerhouse of modern entertainment, we must look beyond the immediate narrative structure and dissect the incredible legacy of its physical production. The late 1980s was an era where practical effects, physical sets, and tangible craftsmanship reigned supreme, and Coming to America stands as one of the ultimate monuments to this golden age of Hollywood production. When you look at the Grand Palace of Zamunda, you aren't looking at a green screen illusion or a digital rendering cooked up in a computer lab. You are looking at massive, meticulously constructed physical sets built on the legendary soundstages of Paramount Pictures. The staggering attention to detail, from the hand-carved pillars and gilded thrones to the cascading indoor water features, creates a heavy, palpable sense of reality that completely alters how the actors carry themselves within the space. This commitment to physical world building is precisely why the film feels so incredibly cinematic and timeless. When James Earl Jones or Madge Sinclair glide through those hallways, the environment naturally commands a specific posture, a slow, deliberate cadence of movement that instantly communicates centuries of unshakable history and royal heritage. Then, when the production shifts to the frozen streets of Queens, New York, the cinematic language undergoes a deliberate, grounding transformation. The filmmakers didn't attempt to recreate New York on a backlot. They took the cast and crew into the bitter, unvarnished winter air of the actual outer boroughs. The dirty snowbanks, the biting wind that causes the actor's breath to fog heavily in front of the camera, and the authentic, crowded architecture of the neighborhood provide a gritty, unfiltered counterweight to the pristine luxury of the first act. This visceral contrast is a technical masterclass, ensuring that the audience doesn't just see the shift in Akeem's world, they completely feel it in their bones. At the very center of this technical triumph sits the revolutionary work of special makeup, effects creator Rick Baker, whose contributions to this film permanently shifted the paradigm of comedic acting and character transformation. Prior to coming to America, heavy prosthetic makeup was almost entirely reserved for the horror and sci-fi genres, used to create monsters, aliens, and disfigured villains. The idea of using hyper-realistic, medical-grade prosthetics to create distinct, grounded comedic characters within a contemporary romantic narrative was an incredibly bold, uncharted creative risk. Baker and his team spent countless hours casting molds of Eddie Murphy and Arsenio Hall's faces, meticulously sculpting entirely new facial structures, wrinkles, and skin textures out of foam latex. The result was an absolute miracle of cinematic illusion. When Murphy transforms into Saul, the elderly Jewish man who sits in the local barbershop arguing about boxing, the transformation is so absolute, so structurally perfect, that audiences in 1988 frequently had no idea they were looking at a 26-year-old black superstar at the peak of his fame. Saul isn't played as a caricature or a cartoonish sketch. He is written and performed with a magnificent, lived-in humanity that feels entirely authentic to the fabric of New York City life. The prosthetics didn't hinder Murphy's performance, they liberated it. By completely obscuring his famous visage, Baker's makeup allowed Murphy to fully submerge his ego into these secondary roles, adjusting his vocal pitch, his physical posture, and his comedic timing to match the exact psychology of each distinct character. This multi-role format wasn't just a flashy gimmick. It was a profound showcase of artistic versatility that added a rich, multi-layered texture to the community surrounding Akeem, making the neighborhood feel incredibly alive, diverse, and steeped in its own rich oral history. Furthermore, we must analyze the incredible subtext of the film's costume design, an element that acts as a silent but immensely powerful engine for character development. Designed by the visionary Deborah Nadelman Landis, the wardrobe in Coming to America functions as a brilliant, visual map of the character's internal motivations and psychological evolutions. In the Kingdom of Zamunda, the costumes are an unapologetic, jaw-dropping celebration of absolute sovereignty. They utilize a breathtaking palette of royal jewel tones, deep sapphires, rich emeralds, and brilliant golds, interwoven with heavy, luxurious silks, intricate hand-woven embroideries, and massive, sweeping furs that project an aura of total majesty. These garments are intentionally designed to look incredibly heavy and restrictive, subtly communicating to the audience that the characters are physically bound by the rigid weight of their titles and traditions. But notice what happens to the visual language of the clothing when Akeem and Semi arrive in New York. To fully immerse himself in the human experience, Akeem deliberately strips away his royal wardrobe, packing his gold-threaded robes into suitcases and locking them away. He transitions into basic, off-the-rack, working-class American attire, heavy woolen beanies, oversized thrift store coats, and eventually, the stark, mass-produced polyester uniform of a McDowell's employee. This deliberate stripping away of his physical status is a brilliant cinematic device. It forces the viewer to focus entirely on the warmth of Akeem's eyes, the gentleness of his expressions, and the inherent nobility of his actions rather than the material wealth that once surrounded him. Conversely, look at Semi's wardrobe choices throughout the New York segment. Semi is a character desperately clinging to the external validation of his status. Even when forced to live in a rundown apartment, he refuses to completely let go of the luxury, choosing to wear high-end, tailored Western suits and expensive leather coats that look completely absurd and out of place in the gritty, blue-collar environment of Queens. This subtle visual friction constantly reinforces their central psychological conflict. Akeem is using his clothing to blend into humanity, while Semi is desperately using his wardrobe to separate himself from it. When we take a step back and examine Coming to America within the macro context of cinema history, its enduring legacy as an absolute masterpiece becomes undeniable. It is a film that successfully achieved the ultimate hat trick of commercial filmmaking. It was a massive, culture-shifting box office juggernaut that shattered systemic industry prejudices, a deeply affecting and emotionally grounded romance that defied the cynical tropes of its era, and an absolutely legendary showcase of character-driven comedic genius that remains endlessly quotable decades later. Its true strength lies in its profound, unwavering commitment to human warmth. John Landis and Eddie Murphy understood a fundamental truth about storytelling that many modern filmmakers have completely forgotten. For comedy to truly stand the test of time, for it to linger in the hearts of an audience for generations, it cannot be rooted in cruelty, mockery, or mean-spirited cynicism. The humor must flow naturally out of the characters' flaws, their contradictions, and their genuine, deeply relatable desires for connection, love, and autonomy. By grounding Eddie Murphy's explosive, chameleonic energy in the story of a gentle, soft-spoken prince who is willing to give up everything just to find a woman who loves him for exactly who he is when the crown is removed, the filmmakers created a timeless piece of cinematic magic. It is a movie that fills your heart with an overwhelming sense of joy and optimism, just as much as it makes you laugh hysterically, leaving a permanent, deeply comforting mark on the soul long after the final frame fades to black. It remains a definitive, monumental 10 out of 10 landmark of popular culture, a brilliant, glowing reminder that no matter what titles society forces us to wear, what expectations surround us, or what walls we build to protect ourselves, the ultimate and most rewarding kingdom we can ever hope to conquer is the one forged by our own kindness, our own integrity, and our own capacity to love with a completely open and uncompromising heart. Beyond the physical, tangible details of production and the groundbreaking visual effects, the true genius of Coming to America lies in how it constructs its legendary comedic ensembles to provide a profound psychological counterweight to the central narrative. Nowhere is this more apparent than inside Clarence's neighborhood barbershop. This single, cramped location operates as the democratic town square of Queens, a place entirely liberated from the artificial protocols of the Zamundin Palace. When Akeem steps through those doors, he enters an arena where a person's worth is measured strictly by the sharpness of their wit, the volume of their voice, and the passion of their arguments. The barbershop scenes are a masterclass in improvisational chemistry and rhythmic ensemble acting. Through the seamless layers of Rick Baker's prosthetics, Eddie Murphy and Arsenio Hall populate this space with a chorus of distinct generational attitudes. You have Clarence, the head barber, whose voice operates at a permanent, frantic yell, constantly making wild, historical pronouncements about boxing matches and civil rights leaders with absolute, unearned certainty. Then you have Morris, played by Hall, who acts as the cynical, dry-witted instigator, poking holes in Clarence's boasts from the safety of his barber chair. And finally, there is Saul, the elderly Jewish neighborhood regular, whose inclusion is a beautiful, understated tribute to the historic, multicultural cross-currents of working-class New York City. What makes these sequences function so brilliantly on a deeper thematic level is how they expand the film's exploration of identity. In Zamunda, Akeem was surrounded by people who agreed with every single word he uttered before he even finished speaking. The court was a vacuum of absolute consensus, but inside the barbershop, consensus is entirely banned. When Clarence, Morris, and Saul engage in a fiery, screaming debate about whether Joe Louis was better than Muhammad Ali, they are participating in a raw, unfiltered human ritual. They are asserting their presence in the world through the sheer force of their personalities. For Akeem, sitting quietly in the corner waiting his turn, This chaos is beautiful. He doesn't want to be deferred to. He wants to be part of the noise. The barbershop serves as his true cultural orientation, teaching him that in America, dignity isn't something granted to you by a royal birthright. It is something you negotiate out loud every single day with your peers. This community dynamic is echoed and amplified in the legendary Black Awareness Week pageant sequence, which introduces the audience to the immortal Randy Watson and his fictional soul band, Sexual Chocolate. Randy Watson, played with excruciating comedic brilliance by Murphy, is a local legend entirely trapped inside the echo chamber of his own mind. Draped in a blindingly bright, high-gloss synthetic velour suit that looks like it belongs in a completely different decade, Randy takes the stage with the supreme confidence of a global superstar. His performance of a classic soul ballad is an absolute clinic in diluted grandeur. His vocals are aggressively off-key, his choreography is hysterically overwrought, and his final microphone drop is met with a dead, echoing silence from the audience. The psychological framing of this scene is pure structural genius. Right there in the middle of that gym, sitting on a folding chair, is an actual royal deity, a man who commands the genuine adoration of an entire nation. Yet, Akeem doesn't look up at Randy Watson with a single shred of aristocratic mockery or upper-class condescension. Instead, his face lights up with a pure, delighted, and completely non-judgmental fascination. He claps with absolute sincerity. This reaction is a critical window into Akeem's internal growth. He isn't looking for polished perfection anymore. He has had 21 years of pristine, flawless, state-mandated choreography in the palace. He is completely enamored by the messy, unpolished, vulnerable reality of human expression. Randy Watson's terrible performance is beautiful to Akeem because it is completely real, completely human, and completely free from the suffocating burden of royal expectations. This brilliant subversion of status and value is what ultimately gives Coming to America its unshakable narrative momentum. Every single sequence in New York acts as a step in Akeem's psychological deconditioning. When he and Semi take jobs at McDowell's, cleaning grease traps and carrying towering bags of garbage to the dumpster, the film effortlessly sidesteps the cheap, mean-spirited rich guy gets humiliated, tropes that plagued so many other 1980s studio comedies. Akeem doesn't view manual labor as a punishment or a source of shame. He treats it with the absolute focus, grace, and dedication of a spiritual practice. When he handles a broom, he moves with an elegant, almost athletic precision that completely confuses his hyper-anxious boss, Cleo McDowell. By showing Akeem finding genuine pride and joy in the most unglamorous tasks imaginable, the film delivers a radical philosophical statement. There is immense, undeniable nobility in all forms of honest work when it is performed with a generous, joyful, and completely humble spirit. By grounding this explosive, chameleonic comedic energy in a deeply sincere story about a young man's desperate, beautiful search for his own autonomy and an authentic human connection, John Landis and Eddie Murphy created a cinematic milestone that effortlessly transcends the era of its creation. It is a film that successfully proved to the entire global film industry that a story anchored by an almost entirely black cast could achieve historic, universal commercial success, while maintaining an uncompromising commitment to cultural pride, structural sophistication, and deep emotional warmth. It remains an absolute, definitive 10 out of 10 landmark of popular culture, a shining, heartwarming reminder that the most valuable crown you can ever hope to wear isn't one made of gold and jewels, but the one forged entirely by your own kindness, your own integrity, and your own courage to love and be loved for exactly who you are when all the titles are stripped away. To fully appreciate the narrative arc's grand design, we must dive deep into the fascinating psychological friction between Prince Akeem and Daryl Jenks, a rivalry that serves as a brilliant critique of class, security, and toxic entitlement. Daryl, played with magnificent, punchable arrogance by Eric LaSalle, represents the exact opposite of everything Akeem is trying to achieve. Daryl is a product of absolute American commercial privilege, the heir to the Soul Glow hair product empire. He is a man who treats his wealth not as a responsibility or a gift, but as an armor and a weapon to dominate everyone around him. The psychological irony embedded within this dynamic is an absolute masterclass in character writing. Daryl is a commoner who carries himself with the toxic, entitled arrogance that one might expect from a spoiled, tyrannical prince, while Akeem, an actual royal deity whose family rules an entire sovereign nation, moves through the world with the profound humility of a saint. Daryl views Lisa McDowell not as a partner or an intellectual equal, but as a premier acquisition, a beautiful status symbol to complement his luxury sports car and his branded lifestyle. When he interacts with Akeem at McDowell's, Daryl speaks with a dripping, patronizing condescension, completely blind to the reality that this impoverished foreign student, cleaning up his discarded fast food wrappers, could buy his entire family's empire with pocket change. This clash of worldviews comes to an absolute boiling point during the formal dinner party hosted by Cleo McDowell. Cleo, driven by his own deep-seated economic anxieties and a desperate desire for upward social mobility, is practically salivating at the prospect of merging his family with the Soul Glow fortune. Sensing Akeem's growing, quiet bond with Lisa, Daryl decides to assert his dominance in the most public, arrogant way possible. Without ever consulting Lisa, without ever asking for her consent or having a private conversation about their future, Daryl stands up in front of the entire party and unilaterally announces their formal engagement. It is a moment of supreme, patriarchal hubris that completely exposes his view of relationships as corporate mergers. For Lisa, this public announcement is the absolute final straw. Shari Headley plays this realization with a beautiful, fierce dignity. She looks at Daryl and sees a lifetime of being managed, silenced, and treated like a prized possession. Distraught, angry, and deeply suffocated by her father's aggressive capitalist ambitions, she storms out of the party and into the quiet, falling New York snow. It is here, away from the suffocating lights of material expectation, that she finds Akeem. As they walk together through the winter night, the visual language of the film shifts into something incredibly tender and intimate. Akeem doesn't try to impress her with grand promises or material boasts. Instead, he listens. He validates her intellect, honors her independence, and offers her a safe harbor of genuine respect and emotional clarity. When they share a passionate kiss under the street lamps, it represents a massive thematic victory for the film. Lisa hasn't chosen Akeem because of a crown. She has chosen him because of his character. She has fallen in love with a man she believes makes a living sweeping floors and clearing tables, proving that her moral compass is entirely uncorrupted by her father's materialism. Akeem is completely overjoyed, experiencing the pure, intoxicating high of knowing he has finally achieved his lifelong dream. He is loved entirely for himself. He resolves to tell her the absolute truth about his identity the very next morning, wanting to build their future on a foundation of complete, uncompromising honesty. But the narrative demands a heavy price before that truth can be revealed. The very next morning, the grand, structural weight of Zamunda collides directly with the gritty reality of Queens. King Jafar and the royal court arrive in a fleet of stretch limousines, completely shutting down the neighborhood with an overwhelming show of absolute authority. The sequence where the king and queen march directly into the McDowell home, dripping in gold and furs, is both brilliantly funny and dripping with dramatic tension. When Cleo McDowell realizes that the quiet, polite worker he has been underpaying and ordering around is a literal prince, John Amos delivers a performance of manic, hysterical sycophancy that perfectly illustrates how easily human beings will bend the knee to raw power. However, for Lisa, the revelation brings nothing but profound heartbreak and a deep sense of betrayal. When she looks at Akeem, She doesn't see a fairy tale prince who has come to rescue her. She sees a wealthy tourist who treated her life, her struggles, and her genuine emotions as a game. She feels deeply manipulated, believing that his calculated poverty was nothing more than an exotic vacation from his actual reality. The confrontation between them in the pouring rain outside her apartment is the absolute emotional zenith of the entire film. The bright, comedic energy of the movie is completely washed away by the storm, leaving only raw, exposed pain. Akeem desperately tries to explain that he hid his identity because he wanted something real, but Lisa, blinded by hurt, completely rejects him. She reminds him that trust is the foundation of love, and by denying her the truth, he denied her the agency to choose her own destiny. This devastating moment forces the audience to confront the complex moral cost of Akeem's deception, elevating the film from a light-hearted romance into a deeply resonant human drama. It shows that even when a lie is born out of a pure desire for love, it still carries the power to fracture human connection if it robs the other person of their autonomy. Defeated, heartbroken, and forced to face the harsh consequences of his choices, Akeem agrees to return to Zamunda with his family, preparing to accept the very life of hollow protocol he fought so desperately to escape, leaving his heart permanently behind in the streets of Queens. The visual regression that follows Akeem's departure from Queens is one of the most subtly tragic sequences in the entire film. As the royal transport tears across the Atlantic, returning to the pristine, untouched paradise of Zamunda, director John Landis deliberately drains the vibrant, street-level warmth that defined the New York landscape. The tight, intimate close-ups that captured the shared glances between Akeem and Lisa are instantly replaced by vast, sterile, and rigidly symmetrical compositions inside the royal jet. The silence within the cabin is deafening, heavy with a crushing sense of defeat. Akeem sits completely motionless, stared down by the imposing authority of his father, looking like a man who has not just lost a girl, but has lost his very soul. He has been forced back into his golden cage, and for the first time in his life, the bars feel completely suffocating because he finally knows what it feels like to be free. Upon their return to the palace, the ancient machinery of Zamundan tradition immediately spins back into motion, entirely unbothered by the internal devastation of its heir. The morning of the arranged wedding arrives with the exact same grand, sweeping opulence that opened the film: the full orchestra, the lines of bowing servants, the scattering of rose petals. But the psychological atmosphere has completely curdled. Akeem allows himself to be dressed in his heavy, gold-threaded royal garments like a corpse being prepared for burial. His face is a totally blank mask of absolute resignation. He has surrendered his personal agency, accepted the heavy burden of his dynastic duty, and resigned himself to a lifetime of hollow protocol, completely convinced that his incredible journey to America was nothing more than a beautiful, transient illusion that has shattered against the unyielding wall of reality. The narrative architectural design of the wedding ceremony is an absolute masterclass in tension building, visual majesty, and emotional misdirection. As the palace doors swing open, revealing the grand, operatic scale of the royal court, the camera tracks slowly down the long, intimidating aisle. Traditional African horn players and dancers move with a hypnotic, rhythmic grace, celebrating a union that the audience knows is rooted in absolute emotional stagnation. Akeem stands at the altar alongside King Jafar, his eyes staring straight ahead into the vacuum of his future. The heavily veiled bride emerges, her steps slow, measured, and perfectly synchronized with the ancient choreography of the court. Every single beat of the scene is designed to make the audience feel a deep, aching sense of disappointment. We are watching a great man succumb to the crushing weight of systemic conditioning. But the moment the bride finally reaches the altar and slowly lifts her heavy, traditional veil, the film delivers one of the most staggeringly triumphant, emotionally explosive reveals in the entire history of cinema. It is Lisa, the cold, rigid formality of the palace is instantly shattered as the screen erupts with an overwhelming, radiant warmth. The creative choice to keep the audience in the dark until the exact moment Akeem sees her face is a stroke of pure storytelling genius, maximizing the viewer's emotional release. This twist carries such immense narrative power because it isn't a cheap, unearned trick. It is the natural, hard-won culmination of profound character evolution that occurred entirely off-screen. Lisa didn't travel halfway across the globe because she suddenly coveted a royal title, and she didn't do it because she was seduced by the material grandeur of Zamunda. She did it because, in the quiet, empty days following Akeem's departure from Queens, she had a profound psychological realization. She realized that the man she had fallen in love with, the polite, hard-working, and deeply respectful man who happily mopped floors and lived in a freezing slum, was the exact same man regardless of whether he was wearing a grease-stained apron or a royal crown. His wealth didn't define his character defined his wealth. She understood that his willingness to strip away his entire identity, just to win her heart based on his intrinsic humanity alone, was the ultimate, most radical act of genuine devotion a human being could offer. She chose to step into his world because he had proven he was entirely willing to sacrifice his own world just to be equal with her. The final, brilliant exchange between the newlywed couple as they ride through the cheering crowds of Zamunda in an open carriage provides the ultimate thematic punctuation mark for the entire narrative. As they look out over the vast, breathtaking kingdom that they will one day rule together, Lisa turns to Akeem with a playful, fiercely independent smile and asks him if he is truly willing to give up his entire empire just for her. With a magnificent, loving grin, Akeem looks directly into her eyes and replies, "No." It is a pitch-perfect, hilariously witty punchline that keeps the movie firmly rooted in its comedic identity, but underneath the immediate laughter, it carries a heavy philosophical truth. It signals to the audience that Akeem didn't have to destroy his heritage to claim his personal freedom, and Lisa didn't have to sacrifice her fierce, uncompromising independence to become a queen. They didn't conform to the system, they forced the system to evolve around them. By choosing each other on a foundation of absolute equality, transparency, and mutual respect, they have completely dismantled the ancient, stagnant paradigm of the Zamundan court. They have proven that the most powerful traditions are not the ones we inherit blindly out of fear, but the ones we actively choose to build ourselves, rooted in an unwavering commitment to look past the illusions of status and honor the raw, unvarnished humanity of the people we love.